Chief Ranger Joseph Blackhawk dropped his radio, the static cutting through morning silence like a death rattle. The massive grizzly bear stood motionless over what appeared to be another bear's body, but something was terribly wrong. The standing bear's shoulders were shaking. This wasn't territorial aggression, this was grief. Ranger Martinez stumbled backward, his boots scraping against gravel as he whispered into his headset, "Jesus Christ, Joe, that bear is crying." The fallen female lay twisted in unnatural angles, dark coils still wrapped around her torso like some prehistoric nightmare, while the male kept nudging her snout with desperate, gentle pushes. Joseph had seen death in these mountains for 30 years, but never like this. Never a wild animal displaying such raw human emotion over a mate. The morning light caught the tears tracking down the grizzly's muzzle, each drop hitting the blood-soaked earth with impossible tenderness. "All units to Sector 7 now." Joseph's voice cracked as his own memories of loss crashed over him. How could a bear love this deeply? And what had attacked them? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The wilderness of Glacier National Park had always been Joseph Blackhawk's sanctuary, but today the familiar pine-scented air carried something foreign, the metallic tang of blood and the musk of fear. At 52, the Lakota Ranger had spent 3 decades walking these trails, yet nothing had prepared him for the scene unfolding in Sector 7. Magnus, the 15-year-old grizzly bear now standing vigil, carried scars that told stories most rangers could only guess at. Deep claw marks striped his shoulders, and his left ear bore the telltale notch of a snare trap. But it was his eyes, dark, intelligent, and unmistakably haunted, that set him apart from every other bear in the park. Those eyes had seen too much human cruelty, yet somehow retained a capacity for love that defied everything Joseph knew about wild animals. Luna, the 8-year-old female lying motionless beneath the retreating python's coils, represented everything pure about the wilderness. Born in these mountains, she had never known captivity or human interference. Her golden-brown coat, now matted with blood and dirt, had always gleamed like spun honey in the morning light. The way Magnus positioned his massive frame over her smaller body spoke of a bond that transcended mere animal instinct. 2 miles down the mountain, the Glacier Wildlife Recovery Center buzzed with its usual morning activity. Eleanor Whitehorse, 75 and spry as a woman half her age, arrived at dawn as she had every day for the past 5 years. The Crow tribe elder had found purpose in volunteering after losing her husband Thomas and son Tommy, one to cancer, the other to war. Her weathered hands, once gentle enough to soothe dying soldiers in Vietnam field hospitals, now prepared medications for injured wildlife with the same tender precision. "Morning, Ellie," called Margaret Stormcloud from across the recovery ward. At 68, the retired Cheyenne nurse moved with practiced efficiency between the animal enclosures, her silver braids catching the fluorescent light. Maggie had dedicated 40 years to healing humans before discovering that wounded animals needed the same compassion she'd given countless patients. Since her husband's death from cancer 3 years ago, the Wildlife Center had become her refuge from the echo of empty rooms. Dr. Sarah Lightfoot checked her watch as she unlocked the veterinary clinic. The Cherokee Veterinarian's Day typically began with routine checkups and medication adjustments, not the emergency that was about to shatter the morning's peace. At 45, Sarah carried her own burdens, a messy divorce and a 16-year-old daughter who barely spoke to her anymore. The animals didn't judge her failures as a wife or mother, they simply needed her skill and compassion. None of them knew that 8 miles away, a love story was unfolding that would test everything they believed about the boundaries between human and animal emotion. The radio crackled to life, and Joseph's urgent voice cut through their peaceful routine like a blade. Emergency in Sector 7. Grizzly down. Possible snake attack. Send everything you've got. Eleanor's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the concrete floor. The morning had started like any other for Magnus and Luna. They had descended from their den in the high country as the first golden rays pierced the canopy, following the familiar game trail toward the rushing waters of McDonald Creek. Magnus walked slightly behind Luna, as he always did, close enough to protect, far enough to let her lead. This arrangement had become their rhythm over the past 2 years, ever since that first tentative meeting when Luna had approached his solitary fishing spot without fear. Magnus remembered that day with crystalline clarity. He had been alone for so long, scarred by memories of the Thompson family, who had raised him from a cub before abandoning him when he grew too large for their backyard. The betrayal had taught him to mistrust humans, but it had also left him with an unusual understanding of their ways, an intelligence that set him apart from other bears. When Luna first approached him, her golden coat gleaming in dappled sunlight, she hadn't flinched at his scars or his unusual size. She had simply sat beside him at the water's edge and begun fishing, as if they had always been meant to share this space. The creek ran high with late summer snowmelt, creating perfect conditions for the salmon run that would sustain them through the coming winter. Luna had developed a graceful technique for catching fish, waiting patiently in the shallows before striking with lightning precision. Magnus preferred the deeper pools, his greater size allowing him to wade into currents that would sweep smaller bears downstream. Together, they had established a productive partnership that went beyond mere survival. They had created a life. As Luna lowered her head to drink from the crystal-clear water, Magnus scanned the surrounding forest. His heightened awareness came from years of living on the edge between human and wild worlds. He could identify the sound of approaching hikers from a mile away, distinguish between the rumble of Park Service vehicles and tourist cars, and sense disturbances in the natural order that other bears missed entirely. This morning, something felt wrong. The python emerged from the water with prehistoric silence, its 18-foot length cutting through the current like a living shadow. Burmese pythons had no business in Montana's wilderness. They belonged to the swamps of Florida, thousands of miles away. But this particular snake had been deliberately transported here as part of a scheme Magnus couldn't comprehend. All he knew was that the massive serpent moved toward Luna with deadly purpose. The attack happened faster than thought. Luna's head was still lowered to the water when the python struck, powerful coils wrapping around her midsection with crushing force. Her startled cry, part growl, part scream, pierced the morning air like a physical blow to Magnus's chest. The sound triggered every protective instinct he possessed, along with deeper memories of loss that he kept buried in the darkest corners of his mind. Magnus didn't hesitate. 700 pounds of muscle and fury launched into the creek, water exploding around him as he closed the distance to Luna in 3 massive bounds. The python, sensing a new threat, tightened its coils around Luna's ribs, and Magnus heard the sickening sound of her labored breathing as the snake's crushing embrace restricted her lungs. The battle that followed was primal and terrible. Magnus raked his claws along the python's thick body, drawing deep furrows that leaked dark blood into the churning water. The snake's head whipped toward him, jaws gaping to reveal needle-sharp teeth designed for gripping prey. Magnus caught the serpent's neck in his powerful jaws, feeling bones crunch beneath the pressure of his bite, but the python's coils only tightened in response. Luna's eyes found his across the chaos of thrashing water and blood. In that gaze, Magnus saw not just pain and fear, but trust, absolute faith that he would save her, even if it cost him everything. That look gave him strength beyond his physical limits. He released the python's neck and repositioned himself, using his weight to pin the snake's middle section against the rocky creek bottom while simultaneously clawing at the coils around Luna. The python, faced with the choice between maintaining its grip on Luna or defending itself against Magnus's relentless assault, finally chose survival. The crushing coils loosened, and Luna collapsed into the shallow water, gasping for air as the massive snake slithered away upstream, wounded but alive. Magnus stood over her protectively, his own sides heaving with exhaustion and stress, blood from multiple bite wounds staining his dark fur. That's when Joseph Blackhawk's voice cut through the forest silence, his radio crackling with urgent transmissions. Magnus had encountered humans many times since his abandonment, and his responses ranged from wary avoidance to outright aggression. But something about Luna's condition, the way she lay so still, the irregular rise and fall of her chest, overrode his natural suspicion. When the ranger approached with slow, deliberate movements and speaking in calm tones, Magnus made a choice that would change both their lives. He didn't run. Instead, he positioned himself beside Luna's prone form and looked directly at Joseph, his dark eyes conveying a message that transcended species. Help her. The radio transmission that followed would bring Dr. Sarah Lightfoot racing up the mountain trail with emergency medical equipment, summon Eleanor and Margaret from their morning routines, and set in motion a chain of events that would test the boundaries between human compassion and wild nature. But in that moment, as Magnus gently nuzzled Luna's snout and felt the weak warmth of her breath against his fur, only one thing mattered. She was alive. Badly injured, possibly dying, but alive. And Magnus would not leave her side, not for rangers or veterinarians or anyone else who might try to separate them. He had lost everything once before. He would not lose Luna. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the creek where two species, human and bear, prepared to forge an unlikely alliance born of desperation, compassion, and love. The sight of Dr. Sarah Lightfoot's emergency veterinary truck racing up the mountain trail sent a jolt of hope through Joseph's chest. But Magnus's reaction to the approaching vehicle tested every assumption the ranger had about wild animal behavior. Instead of retreating into the forest at the sound of the diesel engine, the massive Grizzly shifted position to place himself between Luna and the road, his dark eyes tracking the truck's movement with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "Easy, big guy," Joseph murmured, maintaining his position 20 feet from the injured bears. "She's here to help." Sarah emerged from the truck with practiced efficiency, her veterinary bag in one hand and a tranquilizer gun in the other. At 45, she had treated everything from injured eagles to mountain lions, but never under the watchful gaze of a fully conscious grizzly bear who showed no intention of leaving. Magnus's scarred hide told stories of previous encounters with humans, some medical, others clearly violent, yet he remained motionless as Sarah approached. "Joseph, I need you to be ready with that rifle," Sarah called softly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life or death decisions. "If he charges, you take the shot." But Magnus didn't charge. As Sarah knelt beside Luna's prone form, the great bear simply watched, his breathing heavy but controlled. When the veterinarian gently lifted Luna's eyelid to check her pupils, Magnus leaned forward slightly, close enough that Sarah could smell the musk of his fur and hear the low rumble in his chest, not a growl of aggression, but something closer to a whimper of concern. The examination revealed injuries that made Sarah's heart sink. Luna's breathing was shallow and irregular, suggesting internal damage from the python's crushing grip. Dark bruises spread across her ribs like storm clouds, and her left hind leg lay at an unnatural angle. Most concerning was her unconscious state. She hadn't responded to Sarah's initial tests, indicating possible head trauma from when she collapsed. "She needs surgery," Sarah announced, her professional composure masking the growing dread in her stomach. "Complex internal surgery, and she needs it today." The logistical nightmare began immediately. Luna weighed nearly 400 pounds, making transport a challenge under the best circumstances. The nearest facility capable of performing surgery on a grizzly bear was the Wildlife Recovery Center 8 miles down the mountain. But their equipment was outdated, and their surgical suite hadn't been used for anything more complex than setting broken bones in years. "What about the cost?" Joseph asked, though he already knew the answer would be devastating. Sarah's silence spoke volumes. Emergency surgery on a grizzly bear would require bringing in a specialist from the university, renting advanced equipment, and dedicating round-the-clock care for weeks. The estimated cost would easily exceed $75,000, money the cash-strapped Wildlife Center simply didn't have. Their annual budget barely covered routine operations, and recent government funding cuts had forced them to operate on a shoestring. The most shocking development came when they attempted to transport Luna. Magnus, who had never shown anything but wariness toward vehicles, approached the makeshift stretcher as the team loaded his injured mate. When they lifted the rear gate of the transport truck, Magnus reared up on his hind legs and placed his massive paws on the tailgate, as if he intended to climb aboard. "He wants to come with her," whispered Ranger Martinez, his voice filled with amazement. The decision to allow Magnus to accompany Luna violated every protocol in the Park Service manual, but the alternative, forcibly separating them, seemed crueler than the risk. Magnus climbed into the truck bed with surprising gentleness, positioning himself beside Luna's stretcher without disturbing any of the medical equipment. As the vehicle began its careful descent down the mountain road, the massive bear kept his head lowered, one paw resting lightly against Luna's side. Eleanor Whitehorse was waiting at the Wildlife Center when the truck arrived. Her weathered face creased with worry. At 75, she had seen enough suffering, human and animal, to recognize the gravity of the situation immediately, as Magnus jumped down from the truck and followed Luna's stretcher into the facility. Eleanor felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't experienced since her son Tommy's funeral 40 years ago. "That bear loves her," she whispered to Margaret Stormcloud, who stood beside her wringing her hands. "Loves her the way Thomas loved me." Margaret nodded, her nurse's training already cataloging Luna's critical condition. "Honey, love ain't gonna pay for what she needs. That surgery's gonna cost more than this place sees in 6 months." The harsh reality of the situation became clear during the emergency staff meeting that followed. Dr. Sarah laid out Luna's condition in clinical terms: internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention, possible spleen damage, and a complex fracture that would need orthopedic pins. Without surgery within the next 12 hours, Luna would die. With surgery, she had perhaps a 60% chance of survival. Outside the conference room, Magnus had taken up residence in the hallway, his massive frame pressed against the wall nearest to where Luna lay in the preparation area. Eleanor approached him slowly, extending her hand palm up in the gesture she had learned from her grandfather when approaching wild horses. To everyone's amazement, Magnus sniffed her fingers and allowed her to touch his scarred snout. "You remember kindness, don't you, old boy?" Eleanor murmured. "Someone was good to you once." The media attention began within hours. A local news crew, alerted by a Park Service scanner, arrived to film the unprecedented sight of a wild grizzly bear maintaining a bedside vigil. The footage of Magnus lying beside Luna's medical equipment, his eyes never leaving her unconscious form, struck a chord that resonated far beyond Montana's borders. By evening, the story had gone viral. Ashta Magnus and Luna began trending on social media, with hundreds of thousands of people sharing the video of Magnus following the ambulance down the mountain. Donations started trickling in through the Wildlife Center's website, $5 here, $20 there, from people moved by the display of devotion between two animals who weren't supposed to love each other the way humans did. But as night fell and Luna's condition continued to deteriorate, the trickle of donations remained woefully inadequate. They had raised $3,000, not even enough to cover the specialist's travel expenses, let alone the surgery itself. Magnus hadn't eaten since the morning of the attack, and his refusal to leave Luna's side was becoming a medical concern in its own right. Eleanor brought him salmon from the center's freezer, but he merely sniffed the offering before returning his attention to Luna's shallow breathing. "He knows," Margaret observed, checking Luna's vital signs on the monitors. "Somehow, he knows she's dying." As midnight approached, carrying with it the deadline for Luna's surgery, an unexpected development would change everything. A black sedan pulled into the Wildlife Center's parking lot, and from it emerged a man whose arrival would transform their desperate situation into something far more complicated and dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Victor Kane emerged from his black sedan with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. At 55, the corporate executive carried himself with the bearing of someone who viewed every situation as a business opportunity waiting to be exploited. His expensive suit seemed out of place in the rustic setting of the Wildlife Recovery Center, but his smile was perfectly calibrated for the media crews that had gathered outside the facility. "I'm here to help," Kane announced to the assembled reporters, his voice carrying the smooth authority of countless boardroom presentations. "When I heard about this tragic situation, I knew I had to act. These magnificent animals deserve our protection and care." Eleanor Whitehorse watched from the center's front window, her weathered hands gripping the sill as something cold settled in her stomach. In 75 years of living, she had developed an instinct for recognizing wolves in sheep's clothing, and everything about Victor Kane triggered her internal alarm system. The way he positioned himself for the cameras, the calculated pause before each statement, the subtle smile that never quite reached his eyes, it all felt rehearsed. "That man's trouble," she murmured to Margaret, who had joined her at the window. "Mark my words, Maggie. He didn't drive all the way up here in the middle of the night out of the goodness of his heart." Inside the medical wing, Magnus had positioned himself as close to Luna's surgical preparation area as the staff would allow. The massive Grizzly hadn't moved from his vigil in 18 hours, his dark eyes tracking every movement of the medical team. When Dr. Sarah approached with a bowl of fresh salmon, Magnus merely glanced at the offering before returning his attention to Luna's labored breathing. "He's going to collapse if he doesn't eat soon," Sarah told Joseph, who had refused to leave the facility despite being off duty. "I've never seen anything like this. It's as if he understands that she's dying." Kane's entrance into the medical wing was preceded by the sound of expensive leather shoes on linoleum. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room, but his stride faltered slightly when he encountered Magnus. The bear's head turned toward the newcomer, nostrils flaring as he processed an unfamiliar scent that seemed to agitate him. "Magnificent specimen," Kane observed, maintaining a careful distance from the Grizzly. "I understand you're facing some financial challenges with the surgery?" Dr. Sarah nodded reluctantly. "The procedure is complex and expensive. We're looking at costs that exceed our annual operating budget." Kane's smile widened. "Consider that problem solved. I'm prepared to cover all medical expenses, surgery, recovery, ongoing care, whatever these animals need." The relief that flooded through the room was palpable. Margaret pressed her hand to her heart, while Joseph felt the tension that had been building in his shoulders finally begin to ease. Only Eleanor remained skeptical, watching Kane's face for tells that her decades of reading people had taught her to recognize. "That's incredibly generous," Sarah said, though her professional training made her cautious of gifts that seemed too good to be true. "What would you need from us in return?" "Nothing immediate," Kane replied smoothly, "though I would like to discuss the possibility of relocating the bears to a private facility once they've recovered. I have connections with several excellent wildlife parks that could provide them with top-tier care for the rest of their lives. Eleanor's blood turned to ice water. Private facility. You mean like a zoo? Kane's expression remained carefully neutral. Not a zoo, exactly. More of a research and conservation center. These bears would receive the finest care available while contributing to our understanding of wildlife behavior. Magnus chose that moment to rise from his position beside Luna's stretcher, his massive frame unfolding to its full, intimidating height. The bear's eyes fixed on Kane with an intensity that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. A low growl rumbled from deep in Magnus's chest, not the sound of immediate aggression, but something closer to recognition. "Interesting," Kane murmured, studying Magnus with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating a business asset. "He seems quite intelligent for a wild animal." The surgery began at dawn, funded by Kane's seemingly generous donation. Dr. Sarah worked alongside Dr. Robert Clearwater, a specialist in large animal surgery who had driven through the night from the University of Montana. The procedure took place in the center's aging surgical suite, with equipment that Kane's people had upgraded overnight. Magnus remained in the hallway outside the operating room, his massive frame pressed against the wall as close to Luna as the staff would allow. Eleanor had taken up residence beside him, speaking in soft crow phrases that her grandmother had taught her for calming frightened animals. To everyone's amazement, Magnus seemed to find comfort in her presence, occasionally pressing his great head against her small hand. "You understand more than they think, don't you, old boy?" Eleanor whispered. "You've seen the worst of what humans can do, but you still remember the best." The surgery revealed damage that was both better and worse than expected. Luna's spleen had been severely bruised but not ruptured, eliminating the need for its removal. However, the python's crushing embrace had caused internal bleeding that required delicate repair work. Most surprising was Dr. Clearwater's discovery during the procedure. Luna was pregnant, carrying 2 cubs that had somehow survived the trauma. "This changes everything," Dr. Clearwater announced to the assembled team. "We're not just saving 1 life, we're saving 3. The news of Luna's pregnancy spread through the facility like wildfire, transforming an already emotional situation into something that felt miraculous. Magnus seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, his agitation decreasing as the surgery progressed successfully. When Eleanor brought him fresh salmon 6 hours into the procedure, he finally accepted the food, eating with the mechanical efficiency of someone who understood that maintaining his strength was necessary for protecting his family. Kane's reaction to the pregnancy news was subtle but telling. Eleanor, watching from across the room, noticed the slight tightening around his eyes and the way his smile became more forced. The presence of cubs would complicate any plans he might have for relocating the bears, making them more valuable as a breeding pair, but also more difficult to transport and manage. The surgery concluded successfully after 8 grueling hours. Luna was moved to the recovery area, still unconscious but stable, while Magnus was finally allowed to position himself beside her surgical bed. The sight of the massive Grizzly gently placing his paw near Luna's unconscious form brought tears to the eyes of even the most hardened staff members. In 40 years of veterinary practice, Dr. Clearwater told the assembled media outside the facility, "I've never witnessed such devotion between wild animals. This bear has demonstrated levels of emotional intelligence and loyalty that challenge everything we think we know about animal behavior." The story of Magnus and Luna's love captured hearts around the world. Donations poured in from every corner of the globe, school children sending their allowance money, elderly couples touched by the display of lifelong devotion, animal lovers moved by the unprecedented bond between the 2 bears. Within 24 hours, The Wildlife Center had received over $200,000 in donations, more than enough to cover the surgery and ongoing care. But success brought new challenges. Media crews from major networks descended on the small Montana facility, turning the quiet Wildlife Center into a circus of reporters and cameramen. Tour buses began arriving hourly, filled with tourists hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous bears. The attention was overwhelming for a facility accustomed to operating in peaceful obscurity. Kane positioned himself at the center of the media storm, giving interviews about his role in saving the bears, while carefully avoiding specific details about his business interests. Eleanor noticed how he always managed to steer conversations toward the importance of proper wildlife management and the benefits of controlled environments for conservation. "Something's not right about all this," Eleanor confided to Margaret during a rare quiet moment. "That man's got ulterior motives written all over him." Margaret nodded, her nursing instincts having picked up on the same subtle warning signs. "And did you see how Magnus reacted to him? Animals know things about people that we miss." 3 days after the surgery, Luna began showing signs of consciousness. Her eyes opened for brief periods, focusing with difficulty on her surroundings. The first time she spotted Magnus beside her bed, a soft whimper escaped her throat, a sound of recognition and relief that brought tears to everyone present. Magnus's response was immediate and tender. He lowered his massive head to gently nuzzle Luna's snout, producing a low, rumbling sound that seemed to comfort her. The interaction lasted only moments before Luna drifted back into healing sleep, but those moments captured on camera would become some of the most viewed wildlife footage in Internet history. Kane watched these interactions with growing intensity, making notes on a tablet and having hushed phone conversations that Eleanor couldn't quite overhear. His questions to the staff became more specific. How long before the bears could be safely transported? What were the legal requirements for relocating wild animals? Did the cubs' presence change any federal protection statuses? As Luna's recovery progressed and Magnus began to relax his vigilant guard, the true nature of Kane's intentions would soon be revealed. The generous benefactor's mask was beginning to slip, and Eleanor's instincts about the danger he represented would prove more accurate than anyone imagined. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only the bonds between Magnus and Luna, but the community's commitment to protecting the love story that had captured the world's attention. The confrontation began on a crisp October morning when Kane arrived at the Wildlife Center with a team of lawyers and a court order that changed everything. Eleanor watched from the volunteer office window as black SUVs pulled into the parking lot, disgorging men in expensive suits who moved with the predatory efficiency of corporate raiders. The sight made her arthritic hands tremble as she reached for the phone to call Joseph. "We have legal custody of the bears," Kane announced to Dr. Sarah, presenting documents that bore official seals and judicial signatures. As the primary financial contributor to their care, and given the facility's inability to provide long-term accommodation, the court has granted our petition for relocation. Sarah's face went pale as she scanned the legal papers. Kane's lawyers had worked fast, exploiting loopholes in wildlife protection laws that allowed private facilities to assume custody of animals when public institutions lacked adequate resources. The court order was comprehensive and legally binding. Magnus and Luna were to be transferred to Kane's private conservation facility within 48 hours. "This is outrageous," Joseph protested, arriving breathless from his emergency drive to the center. "These bears are wild animals, not property to be bought and sold." Kane's smile carried the cold satisfaction of a predator closing in on wounded prey. "I understand your emotional attachment, Ranger Blackhawk, but emotion doesn't override legal reality. My facility can provide these animals with medical care, proper nutrition, and safety that this underfunded center simply cannot match." Magnus seemed to sense the tension in the room. The massive Grizzly rose from his position beside Luna's recovery bed, his dark eyes moving between the assembled humans with an intelligence that made Kane's lawyers unconsciously step backward. The bear's body language radiated alert wariness, the same posture he adopted when sensing predators in the wild. Eleanor pushed through the crowd of officials, her 75-year-old frame moving with surprising determination. "Now you listen here, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced down death in Vietnam, field hospitals, and raised children through the Great Depression. "These bears chose to trust us. Magnus could have run when Luna was hurt, but he stayed. He trusted us to help her. And you want to repay that trust by locking them in cages?" Kane's expression remained coolly professional, but Eleanor caught a flicker of something darker in his eyes. "Mrs. Whitehorse, I understand your concern, but wild animals don't make choices based on trust. They respond to instinct and conditioning. Magnus stayed because he was confused and frightened, not because he made some conscious decision to seek human help." "That's where you're wrong," Eleanor replied, moving closer to Magnus. The great bear lowered his head, allowing her weathered hand to rest on his scarred snout. "This old boy knows exactly what he's doing. Don't you, Magnus?" The bear's response was immediate and shocking. Magnus gently took Eleanor's hand in his massive jaws, not biting, but holding her fingers with the same delicate care a mother bear might show her cubs. The gesture lasted only seconds, but it spoke volumes about the bond that had formed between human and animal. Kane's facade began to crack. "Touching circus tricks don't change legal realities," he snapped, his smooth corporate manner giving way to something uglier. "I've invested substantial resources in these animals' care, and I have every right to protect that investment." "Investment?" Margaret stepped forward, her nursing instincts bristling at Kane's cold terminology. "These aren't stocks or real estate, Mr. Kane. They're living beings with feelings and relationships." The argument was interrupted by Luna's soft whimper from the recovery bed. The injured bear had awakened during the confrontation, her amber eyes tracking the raised voices and tense body language around her. Magnus immediately moved to her side, positioning himself between Luna and the strangers who had invaded their sanctuary. Kane made his fatal mistake then, reaching toward Luna's bed to examine the medical equipment his money had purchased. Magnus's reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. 700 pounds of protective fury erupted as the Grizzly reared to his full height, releasing a roar that shook the building's windows and sent Kane's lawyers scrambling for the exit. "Stand down!" Joseph shouted, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm, but Magnus wasn't looking at him. The bear's entire focus was fixed on Kane, his lips pulled back to reveal teeth designed for crushing bones. Something primal had been triggered. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the deep animal wisdom that could smell predators regardless of their human disguise. Kane stumbled backward, his corporate composure finally shattered as he found himself face to face with nearly 1,000 pounds of apex predator. "Control that animal!" he screamed at Dr. Sarah. "If it attacks, I'll have it destroyed." Eleanor stepped between Kane and Magnus, her small frame dwarfed by the massive bear but somehow commanding the space through sheer force of will. "Magnus, honey," she said softly, never taking her eyes off Kane. "This man ain't worth the trouble. Come back to Luna. She needs you." The great bear's breathing gradually slowed, his aggressive posture softening as Eleanor's calm voice penetrated his rage. Magnus settled back onto all fours, but remained positioned protectively between Kane and Luna, his dark eyes never leaving the man who had threatened his mate. That evening, as Kane and his legal team retreated to strategize their next move, Eleanor made a phone call that would change everything. Her arthritis-gnarled fingers dialed a number she hadn't used in 20 years. Her nephew, David Whitehorse, now a prominent environmental lawyer in Washington, D.C. "David, honey, it's Aunt Ellie. I need your help with something important. Real important." While Eleanor worked her own legal angles, Joseph began his own investigation into Kane's background. Something about the man's aggressive pursuit of the bears didn't add up. Legitimate wildlife conservationists didn't typically arrive with teams of lawyers and court orders. They certainly didn't react with such venom when their motives were questioned. The breakthrough came at midnight when Joseph's computer search finally yielded results. Victor Kane wasn't just a businessman with an interest in wildlife conservation. He was the CEO of Apex Development Corporation, a company that specialized in converting protected wilderness areas into commercial properties. Their method was always the same: identify environmental problems that threatened public safety, then offer solutions that conveniently required removing protection status from valuable land. The python that had attacked Luna wasn't a random occurrence. Joseph's deeper research revealed that Apex Development had been quietly purchasing land adjacent to Glacier National Park for months, planning a massive resort and casino complex. But environmental protection laws made development impossible as long as the area maintained its status as critical wildlife habitat. Kane's plan was diabolically simple: introduce invasive species that would create public safety concerns, then position his company as the solution. The media attention around Magnus and Luna had been an unexpected complication. Instead of generating fear about dangerous wildlife, their love story had increased public support for conservation. Taking custody of the famous bears would serve multiple purposes. It would remove the most visible symbols of successful wildlife conservation from the area, while positioning Kane as a responsible steward of animal welfare. Once the bears were safely confined in his facility, mysterious accidents could be arranged, generating the kind of tragic headlines that would support his narrative about the dangers of unmanaged wilderness. Joseph's hands shook as he printed the evidence he had uncovered. Financial records showed payments to exotic animal dealers. Email communications discussed wildlife management solutions for the park area. Most damning was a recorded phone conversation where Kane discussed the need to neutralize the bear situation to proceed with development plans. As dawn broke over the Wildlife Center, Joseph prepared to share his discoveries with Eleanor and the others. The legal battle for Magnus and Luna was about to become something much larger, a fight for the soul of the wilderness itself, with two bears who had learned to love serving as unlikely champions for everything wild and free. Magnus seemed to sense the approaching storm. He had spent the night pressed against Luna's recovery bed, his eyes fixed on the facility's entrance. Every few minutes he would lift his great head and sniff the air, as if tracking threats that human senses couldn't detect. The final confrontation was coming, and it would test not only the bonds between human and animal, but the community's willingness to stand against forces that would destroy everything they held dear. The tragedy began with a phone call at 3 a.m. Eleanor jolted awake in her small cabin, her heart hammering as she fumbled for the receiver. In her 75 years, calls at that hour had only brought news of death. First her son Tommy from Vietnam, then her husband Thomas from the cancer ward. "Eleanor, it's Sarah. They took them." The words hit like physical blows. Eleanor's weathered hands gripped the phone as Dr. Sarah's voice cracked with exhaustion and defeat. Kane's legal team had returned with federal marshals and a revised court order that superseded all local jurisdiction. Magnus and Luna had been loaded into transport vehicles while the facility slept, their departure as silent and efficient as a military operation. "Where?" Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "Kane's private facility in Nevada. It's over, Eleanor. We lost them." Eleanor dressed with shaking hands, her mind reeling with the implications. Kane had moved faster than anyone anticipated, exploiting legal loopholes and political connections that rendered their grassroots resistance meaningless. By the time David Whitehorse's environmental challenges could work through the court system, Magnus and Luna would be thousands of miles away in a facility designed more like a prison than a sanctuary. At the Wildlife Center, the staff moved through their morning routines like sleepwalkers. The empty recovery room where Magnus had maintained his vigil felt cavernous without his massive presence. Luna's medical equipment sat unused, its screens dark and silent. Margaret Stormcloud stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she remembered the gentle way Magnus had allowed Eleanor to touch his scarred snout. 40 years I've been a nurse, Margaret whispered to no one in particular. I've seen families torn apart by death, by disease, by war. But I ain't never seen love ripped away by lawyers and legal papers. Joseph arrived to find the facility in mourning. The federal marshals had been thorough in their execution of the court order, leaving no documentation of where the bears had been taken beyond the vague reference to Kane's Nevada facility. Phone calls to federal wildlife agencies yielded only bureaucratic runarounds and transfers to voicemail systems that seemed designed to discourage inquiry. The media response was swift and brutal. News crews that had celebrated the heartwarming love story between Magnus and Luna now found themselves covering a narrative of corporate greed and legal manipulation. Public outrage exploded across social media, with #SaveMagnus and Luna trending worldwide within hours of the story breaking. But public sympathy couldn't overcome legal reality. Kane had played the system perfectly, using the bears' own fame against them. His lawyers argued that the intense media attention made the understaffed Wildlife Center unsuitable for their care, while his substantial financial investment gave him legal standing to protect his interests. Eleanor found herself at the center of a media storm she never wanted. Reporters camped outside her small cabin, shouting questions about her relationship with the bears and her plans to challenge Kane's custody. At 75, she had neither the energy nor the resources to fight a billionaire's legal team, but the memory of Magnus's trust kept her from giving up entirely. The breaking point came when Kane appeared on national television for a primetime interview. Seated in an opulent office with wildlife photography adorning the walls, he presented himself as a misunderstood conservationist whose only crime was caring too much about animal welfare. "These bears are receiving the finest care available," Kane told the sympathetic interviewer. State-of-the-art medical facilities, nutritious diet, protection from the stresses of media attention. They're thriving in an environment designed specifically for their needs. Eleanor watched the interview from her living room, her hands clenched into fists as Kane's smooth lies filled the screen. Behind him, she could see framed photographs of exotic animals in enclosures that looked more like zoo exhibits than natural habitats. The man's smile never wavered as he described Magnus and Luna's new life with the practiced ease of someone selling vacation timeshares. The first hint that Kane's version of events might not be entirely accurate came from an unexpected source. Dr. Maria Santos, a veterinarian who had worked briefly at Kane's Nevada facility, reached out to Eleanor through encrypted messaging apps, her communication careful and coded. "The bears are not thriving," was all the message said, followed by a set of coordinates and a time. Eleanor drove through the night to meet Dr. Santos at a truck stop diner outside Billings. The young veterinarian looked exhausted and frightened, glancing over her shoulder repeatedly as she shared what she had witnessed at Kane's facility. "It's not a conservation center," Dr. Santos whispered across the cracked vinyl booth. "It's a research facility. They're studying animal behavior under stress conditions, running experiments on emotional bonds. Magnus and Luna are being kept in separate enclosures. They can see each other but can't touch." Eleanor's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as her hands began to shake. For how long? The experimental protocol calls for 6 months of separation to study the psychological effects of severing established pair bonds. After that, Dr. Santos couldn't finish the sentence. The cruelty of Kane's plan became clear. He wasn't just exploiting the bears for research, he was deliberately torturing them by using their love for each other as a weapon. Magnus and Luna's famous devotion, which had touched hearts around the world, was being turned against them in service of corporate science. I tried to speak up, Dr. Santos continued, tears flowing freely now. But Kane has everyone there under strict NDAs. Anyone who talks loses their license and faces criminal charges. I'm risking everything by telling you this. Eleanor reached across the table to grasp the young woman's trembling hand. Honey, some things are worth the risk. Those bears trusted us, and we let them down. If we don't fight for them now, who will? The drive back to Montana felt like a funeral procession. Eleanor's mind raced through possible options, all of them seeming futile against Kane's legal and financial advantages. Her nephew David was working through official channels, but court challenges could take years while Magnus and Luna suffered in separation. That night, Eleanor made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew her as a gentle volunteer who spent her days caring for injured wildlife. She picked up her phone and called every contact she had accumulated in 75 years of living, veterans from Tommy's unit who owed her favors, environmental activists from the protest movements of the 60s, journalists who remembered her work during the civil rights era. I'm calling in every debt, she told each of them. 2 bears who learned to love each other are being tortured by a monster in a business suit, and I need help bringing them home. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, Eleanor found herself at the center of a network that spanned from Native American tribal councils to Hollywood celebrities who had been moved by Magnus and Luna's story. Money began flowing into legal defense funds. Investigative journalists started digging into Kane's business empire. Environmental groups organized protests outside his corporate headquarters. But as Eleanor coordinated the growing resistance movement from her small cabin, she couldn't shake the image of Magnus and Luna trapped in separate cages, able to see each other, but unable to touch. Every hour that passed was another hour of psychological torture for 2 animals whose only crime had been loving each other too deeply. Margaret found Eleanor collapsed at her kitchen table at dawn, surrounded by phones and legal documents, her face streaked with tears of exhaustion and rage. "We have to get them back, Maggie," Eleanor whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of phone calls. "That man is destroying them piece by piece, and we're the only ones who can stop him." Margaret knelt beside her oldest friend, taking Eleanor's trembling hands in her own. "Then we'll stop him, honey. Whatever it takes, we'll bring them home." But even as the words left her lips, Margaret wondered if they were already too late. How much psychological damage could Magnus and Luna endure before their famous love story became a tragedy of separation and despair? The clock was ticking, and Kane held all the cards. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, Kane's own arrogance. Dr. Maria Santos had risked everything to smuggle out a single cell phone video that would shatter Kane's carefully constructed public image. The footage, grainy and shaking from being recorded in secret, showed Magnus pressed against the chain-link fence that separated him from Luna's enclosure, his massive frame trembling as he reached through the gaps trying to touch his mate. Eleanor watched the 40-second video with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. In the background, clinical voices could be heard discussing separation anxiety protocols and emotional stress indicators, as if Magnus and Luna were laboratory specimens rather than sentient beings capable of profound love. The sound of Magnus's low, mournful calls to Luna, answered by her equally desperate whimpers, created a soundtrack of pure heartbreak. "My God," Margaret whispered, her nurse's heart breaking at the obvious psychological torture being inflicted. "They're driving them insane." The video's release triggered a media firestorm that dwarfed the original coverage of the Python attack. Within hours, #Free Magnus and Luna had become the most trending hashtag in social media history. Protesters surrounded Kane's corporate headquarters, his Nevada facility, and his personal residences. Celebrity activists joined the cause, while investigative journalists began digging deeper into Kane's business empire. But it was Eleanor's nephew, David, who delivered the killing blow to Kane's operation. Working 18-hour days with a team of environmental lawyers, he had uncovered a paper trail that connected Kane's Apex Development Corporation to the illegal importation of Burmese pythons into Montana. Financial records showed payments to exotic animal dealers, while email communications revealed a deliberate plan to introduce invasive species to justify removing environmental protections from wilderness areas. "Aunt Ellie," David's voice cracked with exhaustion and excitement during their late-night phone call. "We've got him. The python that attacked Luna wasn't some random escaped pet. It was deliberately released as part of Kane's plan to destabilize the ecosystem. He's facing federal charges for environmental terrorism." The FBI raid on Kane's Nevada facility happened at dawn, with Eleanor and a caravan of supporters racing through the night to reach the compound before the bears could be moved again. As federal agents swarmed the research center, Kane's carefully constructed empire began collapsing like a house of cards. Inside the facility, the conditions were worse than even Dr. Santos had described. Magnus and Luna were being held in sterile concrete enclosures, separated by a fence that allowed them to see and smell each other but prevented any physical contact. The psychological torture was evident in their behavior. Magnus had worn a path in the concrete from his endless pacing, while Luna had stopped eating entirely. When the enclosure doors were finally opened, Magnus didn't immediately rush to Luna's side. Instead, the massive Grizzly stood motionless for long moments, as if afraid that moving might cause this dream of freedom to evaporate. Luna, weakened by her refusal to eat, could barely lift her head from where she lay curled in the corner of her prison. Eleanor was the first human Magnus allowed to approach. The great bear's eyes, which had once sparkled with intelligence and warmth, now held a deadness that spoke of profound psychological trauma. When Eleanor extended her weathered hand toward his scarred snout, Magnus flinched, the first time he had ever shown fear of her touch. "It's okay, old boy," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. "You're safe now. We're taking you home." The reunion between Magnus and Luna was both heartbreaking and beautiful. When Magnus finally crossed the threshold between their enclosures, he moved with careful gentleness, as if Luna might disappear if he startled her. The two bears touched noses tentatively, then pressed their massive foreheads together in a gesture that spoke of relief, love, and shared trauma. But the damage Kane had inflicted went deeper than anyone had realized. Dr. Sarah's examination revealed that Luna had miscarried during the stress of separation, losing the cubs that had represented hope for the future. The psychological trauma had manifested in physical symptoms, weight loss, muscle atrophy, and signs of clinical depression that were heartbreaking to witness in wild animals. Magnus had fared little better. The proud bear, who had once stood fearlessly against a python to protect his mate, now startled at sudden movements and showed signs of what veterinary psychologists recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The separation had broken something fundamental in both bears, their trust in the world and in their own ability to protect each other. Kane's arrest brought little satisfaction to those who had fought for the bears' freedom. The damage had been done, and no amount of legal justice could restore what had been stolen from Magnus and Luna. As Kane was led away in handcuffs, his final words to the media revealed the depth of his twisted worldview. "Animals don't feel love the way humans do," he declared, even as federal agents loaded him into a waiting vehicle. What you saw was nothing more than biological programming dressed up as emotion by sentimental fools. Eleanor watched Kane's departure with grim satisfaction, but her attention quickly returned to the bears who had suffered for his greed. The journey back to Montana would be long and difficult, complicated by Magnus and Luna's fragile psychological state. They had lost weight, lost their cubs, and lost the fearless confidence that had once defined their relationship. The transport back to the Wildlife Center required careful coordination. Magnus and Luna could not be separated again, even for the brief time needed to load them into separate carriers, without triggering panic attacks that threatened their physical health. Special accommodations were made to keep them together throughout the journey, with Dr. Sarah monitoring their vital signs, while Eleanor provided the steady, calming presence that seemed to be the only thing that soothed their trauma. During the long drive through the Nevada desert toward Montana, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the nature of love and cruelty. She had seen both in abundance during her 75 years, the love that drove her to volunteer at the Wildlife Center despite her arthritis, the cruelty that had taken her son and husband, the love between Magnus and Luna that had captivated the world, and the cruelty of a man who saw that love as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. "You know what the worst part is, Maggie?" Eleanor said during one of their rest stops, watching through the trailer window as Magnus maintained his protective vigil over Luna's sleeping form. He almost convinced them that love wasn't real. "Look at Magnus. He's afraid to touch her now, afraid that showing affection will somehow make things worse." Margaret nodded, her own heart heavy with the tragedy of what they had witnessed. "But they're still together, Ellie. That has to count for something." Love that's strong doesn't just disappear, even when it's been beaten down. The homecoming to Glacier National Park was subdued compared to the media circus that had surrounded the bears' original rescue. The same reporters who had once celebrated Magnus and Luna's love story now documented their return as traumatized survivors of corporate cruelty. The bears that stepped out of the transport trailer bore little resemblance to the confident, devoted pair who had captured the world's attention. But there were signs of hope. When Magnus caught the scent of the Montana wilderness, pine needles and mountain streams and the promise of winter snow, his ears perked up for the first time since his captivity. Luna, still weak but no longer despairing, lifted her head to sample the familiar air of home. The Wildlife Center had been transformed during their absence. Donations from around the world had funded new facilities designed specifically for Magnus and Luna's rehabilitation. Instead of clinical enclosures, they would recover in a natural habitat that mimicked their wilderness home while providing the medical monitoring they still needed. Joseph Blackhawk stood at the facility's entrance, his weathered face reflecting the mixed emotions of the moment. These were the same bears he had found beside the creek after the python attack, but they were also forever changed by their ordeal. The love between them remained, but it had been tempered by trauma that might take years to fully heal. As Magnus and Luna took their first tentative steps into their new recovery habitat, Eleanor whispered a prayer her grandmother had taught her in the Crow language, words for healing, for hope, and for love that endures even in the darkest of times. The healing began slowly, like ice melting after a long winter. Magnus and Luna's recovery habitat at the Wildlife Center had been designed with their trauma in mind: natural caves for shelter, flowing streams for comfort, and enough space to roam without feeling confined. But for the first week after their return, neither bear ventured far from the entrance where they could see the staff who had fought so hard to bring them home. Eleanor arrived each morning at dawn, carrying a thermos of coffee and a camp chair that she positioned just outside the habitat fence. She didn't speak much during those early visits, understanding that healing required patience and presence rather than words. Magnus would watch her from a distance, his dark eyes still wary but gradually losing the haunted quality that had marked his time in Kane's facility. "You remember kindness, don't you, old boy?" Eleanor would whisper on the mornings when Magnus ventured close enough to hear. It's still there inside you, even after everything that man put you through. Dr. Sarah monitored the bear's recovery with a mixture of professional concern and personal heartbreak. The physical rehabilitation was progressing well. Both bears were regaining weight and muscle tone as their appetite slowly returned. But the psychological healing would take much longer. Magnus still flinched at sudden movements, while Luna often retreated to the deepest part of their cave when unfamiliar people approached. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after their return, triggered by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. George Whitehorse, Eleanor's childhood friend and recently widowed rancher, had driven from his spread near Browning to check on Eleanor and see the famous bears she'd told him about in their renewed correspondence. "Ellie's been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders," George told Margaret as they watched Eleanor sitting beside the habitat fence. "She blames herself for what happened to them, you know. Thinks she should have seen through Cain's lies earlier." George was a man of few words, shaped by 77 years of Montana ranching and the quiet wisdom of the Blackfeet tribe. When he approached the fence where Eleanor sat, Magnus didn't retreat as he did with other strangers. Instead, the great bear stood and walked slowly toward them, drawn by something in George's calm presence. "He knows you've got good medicine," Eleanor observed as Magnus stopped just a few feet from the fence. "Animals can sense things about people that we miss." George reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather pouch, sage and sweetgrass that his grandmother had taught him to carry for protection and healing. The scent seemed to reach Magnus across the intervening space, and for the first time since his ordeal, the bear's posture relaxed completely. That afternoon, something remarkable happened. Luna emerged from the cave where she had been resting and walked directly to Magnus's side. The two bears stood together at the fence, watching the humans who had worked so hard to save them. Then, slowly and deliberately, Magnus lowered his massive head to nuzzle Luna's neck, the first time they had shown physical affection since their rescue. Eleanor felt tears flowing down her weathered cheeks as she watched the gentle interaction. "Look at that, George. They're finding their way back to each other." The staff gathered quietly to witness what felt like a sacred moment. Doctor. Sarah documented the behavior for her medical records, but even her clinical training couldn't diminish the emotional impact of seeing love triumph over trauma. Margaret pressed her hand to her heart, remembering her own long marriage and the way grief could be healed by patient tenderness. Joseph Blackhawk arrived to find the small crowd of humans standing in respectful silence while Magnus and Luna rekindled their bond. The Lakota Ranger had seen many things during his 30 years in the wilderness, but the sight of two traumatized animals choosing to trust again moved him more than he had expected. "In our tradition," Joseph said softly, "we believe that true love creates medicine more powerful than any herb or ceremony. These two are healing each other." As autumn deepened into winter, Magnus and Luna's recovery accelerated. They began exploring more of their habitat, playing in the snow that fell in late November, and engaging in the natural behaviors that had been suppressed during their captivity. Most importantly, they were touching again, gentle nuzzles, playful wrestling, and the intimate grooming that strengthened their pair bond. Eleanor's own healing paralleled that of the bears. The guilt and helplessness she had carried since Cain's betrayal began to lift as she watched Magnus and Luna reclaim their joy. Her friendship with George deepened into something more, as two people who had known loss found comfort in each other's company and shared commitment to protecting what they loved. "You know, Ellie," George said one snowy December morning as they watched Magnus and Luna play together in the fresh powder, "maybe it's time we started thinking about our own second chance at happiness." Eleanor looked at the man who had been writing her letters for months, sharing stories about his late wife and listening to her worries about the bears. "George Whitehorse, are you proposing to me while we're watching two grizzly bears have a snowball fight?" His weathered face crinkled into the smile that had captured her heart when they were teenagers in Browning. "Seems like a perfect time to me. They've taught us that love can survive anything if it's strong enough." The proposal became part of Magnus and Luna's story when Eleanor shared the news with the media that still followed the bears' recovery. The parallel love stories, human and animal, captured hearts around the world and provided a hopeful counterpoint to the trauma that had dominated the narrative for months. Spring brought new life to the Wildlife Center. Magnus and Luna's habitat bloomed with wildflowers, and the bears emerged from their winter rest healthy and content. More importantly, Luna was pregnant again, a development that filled the staff with cautious optimism about the future. The decision about their ultimate fate had been building for months. Magnus and Luna were healthy enough to return to the wild, but their fame made complete freedom impossible. Tourists would seek them out, photographers would pursue them, and their celebrity might ultimately endanger them more than captivity ever could. The solution came from an unexpected source. The Blackfeet Nation offered to provide a permanent home for the bears on tribal land where they could live in natural conditions while being protected from exploitation. The proposal honored both the bears' need for freedom and the community's responsibility to protect them. Eleanor and George's wedding took place on a warm June morning, with Magnus and Luna as the unlikely witnesses to their vows. The ceremony was small and intimate, conducted by Joseph Blackhawk in his capacity as a tribal elder, with Margaret serving as maid of honor and the entire Wildlife Center staff in attendance. As Eleanor and George exchanged rings, Magnus and Luna lounged in the sunshine nearby, their own bond stronger than ever despite the trials they had endured. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Two love stories that had survived separation, trauma, and the worst that humanity could inflict. "Love ain't about the years you have," Eleanor said in her wedding speech, her voice carrying across the small gathering. "It's about the moments that take your breath away. And these old bears have been taking my breath away since the day we met." The future stretched ahead with promise and possibility, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal when tended with patience, compassion, and unwavering love. Dear friends, as we close Magnus and Luna's remarkable journey, I want you to think about the profound truth their story reveals about love in our golden years. At 75, Eleanor Whitehorse discovered that it's never too late for a second chance at happiness. After losing her son to war and her husband to cancer, she could have surrendered to loneliness. Instead, she chose to open her heart, first to two wounded bears, then to George, her childhood sweetheart who returned when she needed him most. Their love story reminds us that the deepest connections often come after we've weathered life's storms. Like Magnus and Luna, who found each other again after trauma and separation, we too can rebuild trust, rediscover joy, and create new chapters filled with purpose and companionship. Eleanor didn't let age or past grief stop her from volunteering, fighting for what she believed in, or saying yes to love when it knocked on her door again. She proved that our most meaningful years might still be ahead of us, if we're brave enough to remain open to life's unexpected gifts. Sometimes the greatest adventures begin when we think our story is ending. Questions for you. What wildlife center in your own life gives you purpose and brings you joy? Have you, like Eleanor, found unexpected love or friendship in this season of life that surprised you? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to open their heart to new possibilities.